Tonight we're going to talk about Hezekiah, and Hezekiah living on borrowed time. And what borrowed time means is you've been given some extra time to live, and he specifically was. And I want us to understand all of us really have. Hezekiah's, I guess I ought to ask the Bible scholars this. What was the name of Hezekiah's father? Ahaz. Good or bad? Very bad. What was the name of Hezekiah's son? That's correct, Manasseh. I was reading your lips there, Wendy. Hezekiah, or was Manasseh good or bad? Probably the worst. And reigned the longest, 55 years. And kind of interesting, if you're keeping up with the daily Bible readings through the Old Testament, we just read about Zimri, Z-I-M-R-I. Zimri reigned the shortest, 1 week, 7 days. He killed the king so he could take over, and a week later, he was drunk and he was in the palace and he saw the rest of the army coming and knew that they were going to kill him, and so he locked himself in the palace and lit it on fire. One of 7 people in the Bible that we know committed suicide. So we're going to go on to some better things. But I want us to think tonight in particular about living on borrowed time. What does that mean, and what do you do? We're going to look first of all at 2 Kings chapter 20. And we're going to read this. And then we're going to look at a little bit of a passage in 2 Chronicles that explains even a little more in depth of what goes on with Hezekiah. Was Hezekiah a good king or a bad king? One of the best. Doesn't it seem strange that he had such an evil father and a more evil son, and he's a good guy? But he wasn't a perfect guy. In those days, Hezekiah became ill and was at the point of death. The prophet Isaiah, son of Amoz, went to him and said, "This is what the Lord says. Put your house in order because you are going to die. You will not recover." I haven't quite been to this point where the doctor says we'll give you a certain amount of time to live. But I had quite an eye-opener several years ago. I had a problem and asked the doctor if, what I should do. He said, "Well, we need to give you a test." And I said, "What do you think it is?" He said, "Well, it could be cancer." That kind of opened your eyes a little bit. I thought about a lady years ago that I took into the doctor, and she had cancer. And she went to the doctor, and I'm sitting there in his office with her, and he had run a whole bunch of tests. She says, "How long do I have to live?" I loved his response. He said, "Do I look like God? I have no idea how long any of us have to live." "Well, if you had to say, what would you say? How long do I have?" He said, "I don't know. No doctor ever knows that." And she just kept pressing him and pressing him. Finally, he said, "I would say probably 6 months to a year." As soon as we left the office, she started notifying everybody, "I've only got 6 months left." And I think that's one of the reasons probably that doctors don't like to say, "Here's how much time you got." I know people who have been given 6 months who live 12 or 15 years. And that's why I loved his first response. "Do I look like God? How would I know how long you have to live?" And so I like this premise, and I'll probably bring it up, if I remember, several times tonight. We are living on borrowed time. Our time is a gift from God. And that's all it is. Hezekiah turned his face to the wall and prayed to the Lord. Remember, Lord, how I've walked before you faithfully and with wholehearted devotion and have done what is good in your eyes. And Hezekiah wept bitterly. And of course, what he said was true. He was a great king. He was a godly king, horrible father, worst son. And here's this bright light in Israel. Before Isaiah had left the middle court, the word of the Lord came back to him. Go back and tell Hezekiah, the ruler of my people, this is what the Lord, the God of your father David, says. I have heard your prayers and seen your tears. I will heal you. On the third day from now, you will go up to the temple of the Lord. I will add 15 years to your life, and I will deliver you and this city from the hand of the king of Assyria. I will defend this city for my sake and for the sake of my servant David. And so if we ever get the idea that prayer doesn't work, probably ought to read this passage. It's sure not a guarantee, but God does change his mind sometimes, doesn't he? Then Isaiah said, prepare a poultice of figs. They did so and applied it to the boil, and he recovered. Hezekiah had asked Isaiah, what will be the sign that the Lord will heal me and that I will go up to the temple of the Lord on the third day from now? Isaiah answered, this is the Lord's sign to you that the Lord will do what he has promised. Shall the shadow go forward 10 steps, or shall it go back 10 steps? And these steps of Ahaz, sometimes it's kind of alluded to that it's kind of like a sundial. And so these steps would tell you what time of the day it was. And there was somebody else that had asked God for a sign. Do you remember who that was? One of the judges by the name of Jerubbaal, also known as Gideon. And he hung out a fleece. And he says, I'm still just not sure. And he hung the fleece out again. And so here this godly king is asking for a sign also. There's some times that folks ask for signs, and I'm just not too familiar with all that. I just find it interesting that he asked God for a sign, and he says, do you want should the shadow go forward on the steps or backward? Verse 10, it's a simple matter for the shadow to go forward 10 steps, said Hezekiah. Rather, have it go back 10 steps. Then the prophet Isaiah called on the Lord, and the Lord made the shadow go back the 10 steps it had gone down on the stairway of Ahaz. And so if this is some kind of a sundial or time measurement, time had already passed, and I think it's also symbolic that we're going to go back and refresh the time. You get more time to live. So the shadow goes backwards. At that time, Marduk-Baladan, son of Baladan, king of Babylon, sent Hezekiah letters and a gift because he had heard of Hezekiah's illness. Hezekiah received the envoys and showed them all that was in his storehouses, the silver, the gold, the spices, and the fine olive oil, his armory, and everything found among his treasures. There was nothing in his palace or in all his kingdom that Hezekiah did not show them. And you got to kind of question the wisdom of this. Here comes a foreign envoy, and it had been prophesied already in the book of Isaiah that Babylon was going to take the Israelites into bondage. And so here Isaiah is, for some reason, and I think we're going to see what the reason is, He shows them everything. And I thought this was kind of like if somebody you don't know calls you up and it's a strange phone number, and they might even have a strange accent, and you decide you're going to give them your social security number and all your passwords. Do you think anybody ever does that? Of course they do. If nobody ever did it, they wouldn't call anybody. And so people do things like that, and it's kind of similar to what Hezekiah did. When people do that, it's because of greed. They have a promise that they're going to receive usually huge, enormous amounts of money. And so they're willing to, I'll take a chance. It's not even a chance. You're going to lose. Hezekiah shows them everything. All the wealth, all the gold, all the silver, everything in the temple. He took us some time. Goes into the armory, shows them all the weaponry that he has. Why would he do that? Pride. I'm not making up that word here. Guessing. We're going to see when we get to 2 Chronicles. That's exactly what it was. Let me show you what I got. Let me show you what I've done. Let me show you the wealth that I've amassed. Let me show you the power that I have. Well, I hope that's not too serious. Sounds like it is, though. Verse 14, then Isaiah the prophet went to King Hezekiah and asked, what did those men say, and where did they come from? From a distant land, Hezekiah replied. They came from Babylon. He's not holding anything back. The prophet asked, what did they see in your palace? They saw everything in my palace, Hezekiah said. There's nothing among my treasures that I did not show them. Then Isaiah said to Hezekiah, hear the word of the Lord. The time will surely come when everything in your palace and all your possessions that you have stored up this day will be carried off to Babylon. Nothing will be left, says the Lord. And some of your descendants, your own flesh and blood, who will be born to you, will be taken away, and they will become eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon. I think verse 19 sounds like one of the most out of character things in this whole chapter, this whole scenario. The word of the Lord you have spoken is good, Hezekiah replied. For he thought, will there not be peace and security in my lifetime? Doesn't that sound awful? That we dare not think like that. I have concern for my children. I have more concern for my grandchildren. What kind of a world are they going to live in? How conducive to Christianity is life going to be when they get a little bit older? And here Hezekiah, this good king, one of the best kings there ever was, Isaiah said, the Babylonians that you just showed everything to are going to come and take all of it away, all your personal things, everything. But it won't be in your lifetime. Whew. Good, I'm in good shape. What kind of a way is that to think? As for the other events of Hezekiah's reign, all his achievements and how he made the pool and the tunnel by which he brought water into the city, are they not written in the book of the annals of the kings of Judah? Hezekiah rested with his ancestors, and Manasseh his son succeeded him as king. How old was Manasseh when he started to reign? 12 years old. 12 years old. I think Hezekiah was, 25? I sure wouldn't want a 12-year-old kid to be king. There's not many 25-year-old people that I'd want to be king. When I was 24, I thought, ripe old age. When I started surveying, Kevin, there were two guys. Most of us were fairly young yet, but there were two guys in the office that were old. They were the same age, and they were old, 34. Life changes. Let's take a look at 2 Chronicles 32. And I want to start reading at verse 24. 2 Chronicles 32 and 24. And the book of Chronicles gives us a little more of an in-depth look at the life of this man who's on borrowed time. How do you live when you're on borrowed time? What does it mean to you? I mean, if you knew, and this is difficult to even imagine, but if you knew that you had 6 months to live and then you found out it's actually going to be 12 years because it's a gift from God, how would that change your life? In those days, Hezekiah became ill and was at the point of death. He prayed to the Lord, who answered him and gave him a miraculous sign. And that's just encapsulates what we read before. I did want to mention this before I get there. Previous to this in 2 Chronicles, they go into a lot more detail that 2 Kings didn't, when it talks about the pool and the tunnel. Hezekiah, when the Assyrian army was gathering in around them and laying siege to them, he blocked off all the water so that their army had no water. And you're thinking, well, what about the people in Jerusalem? He dug a secret tunnel clear down under Jerusalem, and they didn't discover it again until the mid-1800s. It is an amazing feat of engineering. If you ever want to read about that, there's a lot of pictures on the internet of it, and it's just real interesting reading. Back to this kind of encapsulated, again, he was sick, he prayed to God, God gave him a miraculous sign, and then the writer of Chronicles goes a little bit different path and talks about what he was like. Hezekiah's heart was proud, and he did not respond to the kindness showed him. How gracious was God to give him another 15 years to live? And what was his response like? And it's filled with pride, and that's why he told the envoy from Babylon, I want you to see what all I have. I want you to see how powerful I am. Look at me. Therefore the Lord's wrath was on him and on Judah and Jerusalem. Then Hezekiah repented of the pride in his heart, as did the people of Jerusalem. Therefore the Lord's wrath did not come on them during the days of Hezekiah. Hezekiah had very great wealth and honor, and he made treasuries for silver, gold, and for his precious stones, spices, shields, and all kinds of valuables. He also made buildings to store the harvest of grain, new wine, and olive oil. That sound like anybody in the Gospel of Luke that we're going to read about in a few minutes? Bigger barns. He made stalls for various kinds of cattle and pens for the flocks. He built villages and acquired great numbers of flocks and herds, for God had given him very great riches. It was Hezekiah who blocked the upper outlet of the Gihon spring and channeled the water down to the west side of the city of David. He succeeded in everything he undertook. And this was an amazing thing when he rerouted the springs from Gihon and dug this incredible tunnel down way under the city of Jerusalem. And water still flows there today. It's crystal clear water. When he did all that, and he blocked all the springs and all the waterways, so the Assyrian army couldn't get to it, and they're laying siege to Jerusalem. Thinking these guys can only go so long, they're going to run out of water. They weren't going to run out of water. They had a great supply. The Assyrians were going to run out of water. Incidentally, I don't know if you ever noticed or not, I like to just kind of interject a strange fact every once in a while, and I'm going to do that now. How long can a human being go without water?
3 days.
3 days. What's the world's record for going without water? How many?
3 days.
18 days. 18 days. There was a guy that was accidentally locked up over in Germany. And he was in a basement, had nothing, and the police miscommunicated 3 of the police officers. And he was in there for 18 days before somebody went in and checked. And he was almost dead. And you're right. I mean, you can't go without water more than 3 days. You just can't do it. The way he did it, sounds a little bit gross, but he licked water off of the condensation off the walls in the basement. And that's how he survived. Hezekiah, on borrowed time, did not respond well to the kindness shown him. Do you think God's been kind to you? He has, whether you think so or not, whether I think so or not, and I do. I think God's been extremely gracious to me. How do I respond to that? How does that change my life? Verse 31. It's one of those that I kind of meditate on sometimes, but I don't really fully understand it. But when envoys were sent by the rulers of Babylon to ask him about the miraculous sign that had occurred in the land, God left him to test him and to know everything that was in his heart. To what extent did God leave him? Didn't completely leave him, or probably wouldn't have lived. But God left him in order to test him. What are we like when God leaves us? And does God ever leave us? He did this to test, to show what Hezekiah's heart was really like when everything was in his hands and not God's. Borrowed time. What did he do with it? He did all sorts of things with God's power and God's Spirit, and as God gifted him. Incidentally, it's in another text, when the Assyrians laid siege to Jerusalem, they really just didn't have a chance. Sometimes we say they didn't have a prayer, but they did have a prayer. God killed 185,000 of their soldiers. And they did what some of the other armies did sometimes when God stepped in and used his power. They just said, I think we're going to go home. They left. 185,000 dead bodies just laying there. What do we do with our borrowed time? I'm going to look at 2 passages. First one is Galatians chapter 6. And we're going to look at verse 7 through 10. Do not be deceived, God is not mocked. A man reaps what he sows. Whoever sows to please their flesh, from the flesh will reap destruction. Whoever sows to please the Spirit, from the Spirit will reap eternal life. Let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. Therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all people, especially to those who belong to the family of believers. I'm not going to stand here and just spell it out, everything that's good, but we see opportunities to do good all the time. If you drive, you got opportunities to do good. Instead of letting that road rage, and man, doesn't it take over quick? Just relax. Maybe it would help us a little bit to think, I'm living on borrowed time. Maybe I ought to do some good things here. Maybe when you're in the grocery store, and this happens sometimes. I've seen people in a grocery store, usually ladies, that are short. I can't reach that up there. Could you help me? Well, sure I can. Be glad to. Only one time when I was in the store, because I thought this lady, you know how you could just read some people, they got a great sense of humor. I said, you should have thought about this when you quit growing. And she did have a great sense of humor. There was another guy in the store that same day. I could tell right away I'm not joking with him. When you see opportunities to do good, do them, especially to people at the church. What good things can we do for our brothers and sisters in Christ? And he says for all people, just do good. After all, we're living on borrowed time. Colossians chapter 4. And we'll look at verses 5 and 6. Let your conversation be always full of grace, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how to answer everyone. There are good things we could say, and it's a lot easier for some of us just to strike up a conversation with people. I've been known to do that on occasion. That's Colossians 4, 5, and 6. Isn't it? Well, Colossians chapter 4, verse 5 and 6. Be wise in the way you act toward outsiders. Make the most of every opportunity. Is that right? Let your conversation be always full of grace, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how to answer everyone.
Sorry, you knew how to answer me.
I love you so much. Now, can't we do that occasionally instead of saying, why did you have to embarrass me in front of the whole church? But, yes.
The lesson.
You did it just exactly like I told you to. Luke chapter 12. I said we were going to look at this one. Luke chapter 12, verse 13. I think. I'm a little gun shy right now, but I think this is what I want. Someone in the crowd said to him, Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me. What kind of a question's that? Why would somebody ask that question? Because they're getting cheated. I'm not being treated fairly. Jesus replied, "Man, who appointed me a judge or an arbiter between you?" Then he said to him, "Watch out. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions." You understand a little bit now about why they asked that question, why Jesus gives this answer. I'm sure nobody else here has ever seen this, but seeing as how I've done a lot of funeral services, maybe Mike's seen some of this, but people can get pretty vicious when someone in the family dies and they think they're getting treated unfairly. And sometimes they are. But what do you do with it? And so Jesus answers those questions. Watch out. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions. And he told them this parable. The ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest. He thought to himself, "What shall I do? I have no place to store my crops." Then he said, "This is what I'll do. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store my surplus grain. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy. Eat, drink, and be merry." You see, he was on borrowed time. And the note was due. God said to him, "You fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Your borrowed time's run out. It's over. What did you do with the borrowed time that God had already given you?" "I got so much laid up in store, man, I'm in good shape." And what he said was right. I got plenty of grain. A bowl of grain would have been plenty of grain, wouldn't it? Then who will get what you've prepared for yourself? This is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich toward God. No, it's not wrong to prepare for the future. I think that's a good thing. But to not be rich toward God, the one who's given life to you, when you've recognized that you're living on borrowed time, how does that change the way that you live? This evening, if any of you good folks here tonight living on borrowed time want to make a change somehow or another that this church can help you with, we invite you to come forward and let us know how we can do that while we stand and sing.